Everyone. This is, I think, our last spin talk of the year. And we're really fortunate to have Dr. Shereen Fernandez from LSE with us today. She's done work on the political geography and the war on terror, especially in relation to the lives of Muslims, and is doing some projects recently on the implications of artificial intelligence on Muslims and the idea of the globality of Islamophobia. So we're really pleased and privileged to have Shereen here with us today. And just to say that, yeah, this is the last spin event of the year, but be on the lookout for forthcoming newsletters to sort of keep you updated with what's going on. If you have any suggestions for anything you'd like to go in the newsletter, get in touch with Elspeth. But yeah, I guess without further ado, I'll hand things over to Shereen. I think Shereen, I'll put on a timer for about 20 minutes, but I think you can take as long as you like, basically. And we'll have some, and then we'll field some questions from the crowd. So why don't you take us away?
Great, thank you so much. So firstly, thank you so much to Elspeth for inviting me to this series. It's been something that's been on my mind. So working with documents and thinking about this idea of secrecy and what is being revealed to us through the state documents relating to the war on terror is something that I've encountered for several years, and I haven't been able to articulate what these documents are trying to tell us or conceal until today, really, when I was working on this. So thank you so much to Elspeth for the invitation, and also Evelyn too. So my name is Shereen Fernandez. I'm currently an LSE fellow where I teach and research on the implications of AI. And right now I'm thinking about the geopolitics of AI and its relationship to reproducing discourses around Islamophobia and anti-Muslimness. And prior to this, in my PhD, it looked at PREVENT, which is a counter-terrorism or counter-extremism policy in the UK. And I looked at how it is implemented in schools and the effects that it has on Muslim parents and also teachers, with a specific focus on Muslim teachers too. So in many ways, this talk is a reflection of my fieldwork. So doing research on counterterrorism, counter-extremism, and for those in the audience too who have done this, you are coming up against documents in which you are either told that you cannot get the full information for national security purposes. So because I am based in the UK, I'm often dealing with UK state bureaucracies trying to access key documents. And I was often told on my journey to do so that because of national security, you are not allowed to receive the full information. You are receiving the partial information, basically. And you have to build a narrative around what you are accessing. Now, the talk that I will give today touches on questions around visibility, but it also touches upon questions around knowledge production as well. How can we produce knowledge when the documents that we are trying to access are redacted or they are not fully shared? And I'm looking forward to having these conversations in the Q&A too. So I'm going to begin with this quote from this novel called The Invisible Man. And it really highlights some of the complexities that I'm trying to grapple with today. So this quote here: "It is sometimes advantageous to be unseen, although it is most often rather wearing on the nerves. Then too, you're constantly being bumped against by those of poor vision. Or again, you often doubt if you really exist." Now, this quote really encapsulates a lot of what I'm trying to think about. So when it came to the war on terror, when it came to 9/11, Muslims really became visible, right? We were put on the map, so to speak. We were told who we were. We were told about what we were, that we were violent, right? That we had a violent nature to do awful things. And in some ways, Muslims, those racialized as Muslims, wanted to be unseen. They wanted to be unseen from the state, right? Surveillance practices, let's say. In my own research on PREVENT, you've got Muslim parents who often shared to me that this desire for their children to stop talking about certain things, right? To be under that radar so that they are not seen by the state, by the school, so to speak. But there are other ways in which we want to be seen. We want to challenge the narrative, right? We want to change the narrative. But that often comes with consequences, which is what I'm going to touch on today, especially thinking about the memoirs which have come out of Guantanamo Bay. And so when I first think about this idea of secrecy and I think about visibility, I was automatically taken to these images here from Abu Ghraib. So I'm not going to go into detail about, what happened. I'm assuming that everybody knows, but I'm happy to do so in the Q&A. But this picture here of the hooded man really encapsulates what we are trying to get at. So these photos, which emerged out of Abu Ghraib prison, which documented US guards abusing Iraqi detainees who were captured by the US for supposedly being part of or having affiliation to terrorist networks. The hooded man encapsulates this idea of being invisible, that you are not allowed to see your perpetrator, you are not allowed to see those who are torturing you. And given that these photos were not meant to be shown to the world, it's also about concealing their identity, concealing who this person is. But ultimately, it didn't matter, right? They were just one of many of those who were coming through the prison's gates, through the prison system. And I'm going to talk about this idea of the dehumanization of these prisoners too. But in doing so, we're thinking about this idea about what does visibility do to things such as transparency and accountability. So some may argue that the fact that these images were released and they were leaked to press outlets, it created a hysteria, it created that transparency and accountability that we needed. But it took for these awful images of invisibility, so to speak, to come to light, right? So in some cases, you want to you want these images, these horrific images, to be seen. This politics of visibility to really come through. But as I said, this talk is about redaction specifically, and relates back to my own research thinking about documents too. So when I'm thinking about redaction, I'm thinking often about what these spaces or what these images or texts tell us. And as a geographer, I'm very interested in the relationship that these documents have to space, right? What is the spatialization of redaction? Do they have a function? And as I mentioned earlier before, what is being erased and revealed in these documents? So what are we being told? What are we not being told? What is it that we have to guess about these documents? So here is an excerpt from Guantanamo Diary, which is a memoir written by one of the former Guantanamo detainees, known as Mohamedou Ould Slahi. And this was actually part of his one of his chapters, which was fully redacted, but then came to light. I think it was the ACLU who managed to unredact this section. And it teaches us a lot about, who was at the center of a lot of the abuse that he faced, who was at the center of the interactions that he was having in Guantanamo, a lot of which were concealed. And I question about this idea about how redaction is used as a form of protection. So we know, so scholars who are working on the war on terror, working on documents specifically, we know how redaction functions to protect those in power, to conceal the identities of those who are implicated in the worst of crimes. So if those who have picked up Guantanamo Diary, you will see that Mohamedou Ould Slahi refers to this person known as Mr. X throughout the memoir, and Mr. X is one of the principal torturers. We aren't told who this person is. It is fully redacted. The name cannot be shared. I'm guessing for obviously legal reasons, because anybody who identifies themselves as Mr. X will face legal repercussions. And so when we're thinking about what Guantanamo Diary does, we're now entering this period in which former detainees are writing about what happened behind those in Guantanamo Bay, a secret space, so to speak, a space in which journalists were allowed, but they were only allowed to report on things which had to be vetted by the US. Academics were not allowed to enter the space of Guantanamo Bay. And I remember speaking to Lisa Hajar, who was a professor in the States, who said that I had to use my credentials as a journalist to get into Guantanamo Bay. But even then, it was very difficult in, what I could see, what I could not see, what I could report about, what I could write about, and so forth. So Muhammad Oud's memoir really acts as an opportunity, I guess, to visibilize what was once unseen. And this article here, which was taken from The Guardian, really speaks about this idea about Muhammad Oud Slahi becoming visible through the text. That even though we are faced with reductions, even though we are faced with barriers, so to speak, we are seeing, I guess, Muhammad Oud Slahi through the words on the page. And this is the effect of the memoir. This is what the memoir tried to do. In a space such as Guantanamo Bay, which really tried to suppress identities, suppress individuals, suppress the fact that these men were encountering such abuse and torture, these memoirs function as more than text in a book. They function as a mode of activism, as a call for action, I would say specifically. But the other question that I had, especially when I was doing this research, is we've spoken and we've thought about how redaction protects the powerful, how it conceals identities to ensure that abuse never comes to light or the abusers never come to light. But there is also another dynamic which is at play. This idea that a redaction actually is used to protect individuals. It is used to, in this particular case, this excerpt was written by Mohamedou Oud Slahi, who said that actually redaction gave me the opportunity to hide behind the text, right? That sometimes it was embarrassing, that I was afraid of what that I had written. So, and oftentimes we're finding, this is an underexplored area. I haven't really explored this so much, but I'm really interested in this idea of, what does redaction offer us beyond the state, right? How does it protect those, or this idea of hiding behind these ideas of abuse and torture, or what happened in Guantanamo? How does redaction offer them protection? And this is just one example that I found from Mohamedou Oud Slahi, who was speaking about how his book often kept him up at night. It was a form of trauma, reliving it, and redaction offered him that protection. So the question that I have is, in what ways can we see this happening elsewhere, especially as memoirs are going to be emerging from this space? And so in thinking about redaction too, beyond the documents as well, I'm also interested in this idea of redacted detainees. Now, when detainees were detained in Guantanamo Bay, they were rendered into files. They were rendered into figures. They weren't called by their names. They were called by numbers. They became parts of statistics and so forth. And that puts forth this idea about bureaucratic categorization, that they became part of a process. And that process was essential to keep the prison running, considering that there were over 900 Muslim men who were detained in this space, some of which had no idea. I would say a majority had no idea why they were being held, couldn't navigate the legal system, didn't even know that they were in Guantanamo Bay. And so rendering these detainees as files, as documents, as forms of communication became essential. And I draw on Nath's work, even though it is over 10 years old, to think about how detainees were not considered the whole person, the biopolitical function of the redaction, this idea of redaction being a form of dehumanization as well, that the detainee is not necessarily the whole person within these documents, but they are subject to maximal admissible amount of torture, which should be wrought on them because they are not a body, because they are not human, so to speak. Anything goes. And I think that is another function of redaction that we need to consider, right? How these detainees or these Muslim men were redacted from all sense of humanness. Moving on as well to thinking about redaction through geography. I'm very interested in this idea of geographical amnesia, and I think about it a lot in my own research. So as a geographer, and I was working on a podcast about 2 years ago on Guantanamo Bay, and I was thinking about what is it that I was thinking about the relationship between the prison site and private contractors. And something which became very obvious through my research and through speaking to former detainees such as Mozambique was this idea of geographical amnesia, not knowing where you are going. Now, many scholars have written about this idea of ghost flights and rendition projects which took place, this idea that the US military and other states would kidnap those who were suspected of terrorist allegiances or terrorist affiliations, and basically render them on ghost flights to different countries where they were subjected to horrific torture. So one of the primary examples that some of you may come across or may have come across is Binyam Mohammed, who was rendered to a Moroccan jail in which he, before his eventual transfer to Guantanamo Bay. And then in my conversations with Mozam, we were speaking about this idea that many of the prisoners had no idea where they were going. So when they were rendered on their flight to Guantanamo Bay, they were hooded, they were shackled, their ears were covered with goggles. This idea of redacting them or removing them from their senses, that they weren't allowed to hear, they weren't allowed to see where they were going. And I think that contributed to this idea of torture and abuse. It contributed to them not knowing what was going to happen to them. Now, Mozam, in the podcast that I will share in the next slide, spoke to me about how many prisoners were frightened because they thought they were going to places such as Israel. They thought they were going to Egypt. They were threatened by going to prisons in the Gulf. Many of the prisoners knew that these were spaces in which they would be tortured and abuse. And the primary argument that I make in this podcast is this idea that we need to consider how geography played a role in torture. The lack of geography, so to speak, created this feeling of amnesia, but created this idea of punishment too. And so when we're thinking about redaction and we're thinking about questions of secrecy as well, I want to boil down and I want to go right down to the detainees' experiences as well. This idea that not knowing where you are, not being able to use your senses, contributed to this idea of dehumanization, contributed to this idea of abuse and torture as well, beyond things such as documents and very important documents such as the torture report and so on. Now, unfortunately, I can't play the podcast. It didn't work for me. But if you're interested in listening to this and listening to this idea of geographical amnesia in particular, I would suggest listening to this podcast here, which was created by myself 2 years ago, called Leaking Guantanamo. From about 40 minutes onwards is when I start speaking about this relationship of sensory deprivation and geographical amnesia, so not knowing where you're going. And just before I wrap up this presentation, I want to share one profound anecdote which was said to me during this an interview with Mozambique. So during the interview, we were speaking about the conditions of the prison. We were speaking about what was the everyday life like, and so on. And he mentioned to me this idea. He mentioned to me this story that when they were held in Guantanamo Bay, when they looked out of the fence, they would see the ocean, right? And they were amazed, like, wow, look, there's an ocean. There was sometimes a cruise ship on the ocean. And for those detainees from Afghanistan, Mozan mentioned that it was probably the first time in which they had ever seen the sea, and they were all amazed, and they would gather outside to see this. The next day comes, they go back outside, and Mozam says that he notices that actually there's tarp all around the fence, right? And for me, it made me think about this question about visibility. What is allowed to be seen and what is not allowed to be seen? And so from then on, Mozam was telling me that you couldn't see the sea, you could hear it, you could smell it, but you just couldn't see it. There was something so sinister about this visibility of seeing beyond the prison gates or the prison fence. And so I'm going to end there. And I just wanted to share that because I thought it was really profound, especially when we're thinking about this idea about secrecy and visibility and the war on terror and the many ways in which we can think about this from state documents right down to the experiences of the detainees. So yes, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
That's terrific. Thanks, Shereen. Now I'll open the floor up for questions and a conversation. Shereen, did you want to unshare your screen so that we can maybe
Yeah,
get
let me do that.
And I definitely encourage anyone to turn on your cameras, so if you're able to, so that we can have a bit of a bit more rapport. So yeah, any questions from the floor? start things off. Oh, I can see Elspeth.
Shereen, hi. Sorry. Thank you
I
for your sharing your work with us today. I'm excited to actually have a conversation with you a bit more because I'd love to know a bit more about where your work is taking you next. But I think going back to the project that you're presenting us with here, um, I'm interested in maybe your research process and what came first in terms of your sets of questions. Did you notice all of this invisibility and hiding first, or did you
mm,
come to it eventually? I mean, do you have a sense of how, um, what the progress was in your work?
yeah, absolutely. I guess the questions about this came up during my PhD fieldwork, especially. So thinking about there's a sense of paranoia that was associated with doing work on prevent, right? As a Muslim woman, working in the academy, I was working in the backdrop of the war on terror still happening. I was working in the backdrop of things like the Trojan Horse Affair. So for those who don't know, the Trojan Horse Affair was a series of events which took place in UK schools in which Islamists were there was an alleged plot by Islamists to take over schools. So I was working in this backdrop in which Muslims felt incredibly securitized. And so when I'm accessing or trying to access these documents, right, whether it was something as simple, and I say simple, because prevent is considered to be part of like the softer edge of counter-terrorism, counter-extremism, I was still coming up against this idea of I'm not allowed to know which areas are designated to be priority areas, let's say, for national security purposes. Now, I could have gone either way. I could have probed that further, but probing that further then means encountering the state. And I go back to that first slide in which I'm speaking about this idea about, do we want to be seen? And so I was questioning that. Do I want to be seen to the state, right? Do I want to have these engagements and conversations with them about something quite insignificant? I didn't need to know this information. I didn't really need to know um, what was considered to be a priority area, let's say. But it did force me to question things such as what I am able to navigate and what I am not able to navigate. And I see that Lisa Stempnitsky is here, big fan of your work, especially this idea about knowledge production in the terrorism industry, right? And this relates back to this question of visibility and invisibility and not wanting to encounter the state for these reasons comes back to this idea of knowledge production. What can I produce? What knowledge can I produce based on this unwillingness, let's say, to engage with the state? So I guess that was the first question that came to my mind. Do I want to be visible? Do I want to be remain under the radar? Just get the PhD out the way and that's it. So that's when I first encountered it. And then as I was progressing through the PhD, so we're thinking about visibility as a methodology, right? We're thinking about this idea of um, so my research looks at how does the prevent document follow you through the school space, right? And I'm speaking to Muslim teachers who are saying, we're keeping our heads down. We're trying not to be seen. We don't want to be seen by our leaders, our heads of year, and so forth, because we just simply don't want to be referred to prevent. When it comes to training, for example, and every staff member has to be trained in prevent, we're trying not to speak up because we don't want to be heard. We don't want our voice to be heard because we want to remain unseen. And so these questions are fundamental to um, my research. They're fundamental to understanding things such as knowledge production. Who gets um, who gets to create knowledge about these documents? And as Nath, I think, reminds us in this paper, we often have to construct these conversations because of their absence, right? We have to create some sort of narrative based on what we aren't told. And I think that's a very useful starting point. And I hope that answers your question, Elspeth.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Peter, I see you have a hand up.
Hi, yeah, brilliant talk. Thanks very much indeed. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Yeah, I just wondered, so I guess it's more of like a suggestion, not necessarily a question, but like something you might want to think about, maybe looking into it. So I do kind of similar work, like I've done work on like the Iraq War detention and links in with things like rendition and Maya Hour and those kind of things. And one thing I keep bumping up against is like this idea that like states they have all these silos, right? And they're incredibly powerful, and they put information, they put all these caveats, and kind of, you come across them when you read like documents, and some of them and others that you have to go, oh God, I haven't heard of that one, but and then you go, oh, it's this, or sometimes you just have no idea.
Yeah.
But like, even with all those things, right, stuff kind of comes out in weird ways, and so you never quite, like, a state can never be sure that what's on its official record isn't going to kind of come into the, whether it's by like a leaker, do you remember, I suppose about 2010, 2011, there was like a profile got leaked of every person who was held in Guantanamo. And then, like, everyone was like, oh my God. And there was loads that spurred lots of different things. So it might be, so sorry, it's not really a question, but just something like, put it in the back of your head, right? And if anything comes up around it, get in touch.
Absolutely. I think what you say, Peter, is really interesting, because I was also thinking when I was doing this presentation, the function of leaks, right? Especially when it came to Abu Ghraib, that the photos were leaked, essentially. But, what is the function of this? And we've seen it with WikiLeaks as well. For example, when the Guantanamo files were being released, so there was something to be said. And I think that's a very useful suggestion and comment, actually, to keep it at the back of my mind.
Great, thanks. And sorry, Peter, could you just retrospectively now introduce yourself for the sake of the group?
Oh, yeah, sure. So, hi, everyone. Sadly, I don't make it to many of these because I'm always involved in academic misconduct meetings that tend to happen in the afternoon after lunch. But yeah, so I'm a senior lecturer in politics at Kingston. And last year I co-edited a volume on the official record, and that's like UK, US focused. And then my PhD research was on the Iraq War detention regime with the US and the UK, and I've kind of done research on things like freedom of information and all like that. Those like kind of oversighty type spaces in kind of a democratic context, if that makes sense.
Terrific. Yes, lots of connections there. That's terrific.
And it wasn't your academic misconduct, was it, Peter?
No. For my sins, I manage academic misconduct within my department, and we're a big department. We've got like 3 disciplines, and so it's just like,
I like the idea that you're committing academic misconduct on a weekly basis, such that you need a meeting.
It's all ChatGPT, but I'm sure you're all aware.
Brian, could I have you introduce yourself and ask your question?
Okay. Yeah, I'm Brian Rappert from University of Exeter. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks for that talk. I wanted to get into the topic of redaction and its relation to knowledge production, and I guess in some situations, right, that there might be a lot of text redacted or withheld is not necessarily treated as a problem. Maybe sometimes it's treated as an opportunity. So I don't know, maybe in a documentary, the producers or whatever might be able to allude to all sorts of secret documents, which we can't get a hold of. You can kind of call the state to account because it isn't coming out with information. The people who won't talk, right, is often kind of part of the story. But I guess sometimes it can go beyond that too, right? I mean, it's also a way in which partial information can be very kind of, if I can say, kind of productive or generative, right? Because if you don't know who's in those documents, then it could be not anyone, okay? But it could be lots of people, and that's that's ripe for speculation. It's ripe for different kinds of theories, or whatever kind of conspiracy theories, all sorts of ways in which maybe, if I can say it that way, like the state, right, might want to limit information, but in doing that, just in some ways, creates a lot of suspicions and narratives, which it might not kind of otherwise kind of want out. So I guess, I mean, I'm kind of saying these things partially too because I know, there's a few of us, in the Spin Network who been trying to think, okay, well, how do we creatively or something like that relate to the amount of redacted material we have to face, and what does that mean for the way in which we write and so on. And I guess, anyway, so I'll come around to my sort of question here, which is what does the way in which you're thinking about redactions, what does it what does it tell you? What does it tell us about what you want out of this research? Like, are you trying to I want to establish the truth, like I want like a historian, I want to know what happened, right?
Yeah.
And I want to know that maybe because the people that you're looking at and studying they want to know, right? And so there's this big commitment to let's get the facts and let's just try to get as much detail in as we can. Um, because, well, I don't know. I mean, that's, you could say that's my goal. That's what I want to do. And then
Yeah.
redaction's a problem.
Yeah.
But if your goal is maybe something else, then, redaction may not be a problem in the same way. So I don't know. I guess I'm just encouraging you to think what is it you want out of this research? How does that relate to the people you're researching? Any kind of comments you want to
that's fast. Thank you so much, Brian. I think that's really useful to think about. So I think when I initially approach this idea of redaction, you see it very negatively, right? You see it from the perspective of the state, that the state is redacting XYZ information. What are they trying to hide? What is it that they don't want to know? And the further I got into this research, especially thinking about memoirs and the function of redaction there, it was really interesting to see that narrative put forth by Mohamedou, who wrote Guantanamo Diary, saying, well, actually, redaction offered me a form of protection, that I could hide behind redaction, that I could say, it wasn't keeping me up at night so much. So, because I was, some critical information was being concealed, let's say, or maybe it wasn't even critical. It might have been quite mundane things, but it shows how, I guess in that interview, he was saying that, I've changed so much and the redaction offers me that protection against sort of the scrutiny that I may face. And I think that's what's interesting. I think that redaction, the questions I'm interested in are not so much, I would love it if the state would unredact everything, right? So that we could see what was happening. But I'm sort of interested in questions around power, but also erasure and visibility as well. So even if a document is redacted, right, what narratives can we construct about it? What is the state trying to tell us through its redaction? So in some of the cases that I was looking at, for example, I think it was the torture report and some other memos, you had a whole page redacted except one sentence saying this does not fit in or corroborate with the literature review. Well, why would the state just include that one section, right? Well, what are you trying to tell us? And I think those are the questions that I'm interested in, as opposed to questions about redaction equaling truth. I'm interested in those biopolitical and geopolitical functions of redaction. And moving also away from this idea of just documents too. So thinking about the detainee as redaction, the sort of amnesia as redaction, this removing the geographical essence away from, so people don't know where they are, right? The sensory deprivation, so that you don't know if you are still in Afghanistan, still in Pakistan, or in Guantanamo Bay. So Mohamedou Slahi, when he's talking about the torture that he faces on a boat, for example, he's hooded, he's shackled, he's being told you're going to be taken to Egypt, where you're going to be faced X, Y, Z, and he's still in Guantanamo Bay, right? He's still in Guantanamo Bay, but he doesn't know that. And so we're thinking about redaction of, not so much in the sense of redacting materials from documents, but redacting you from that experience of being human, right? Removing that geographical sense of where you are, which I think is really interesting to me. So I guess the end purpose for me, just to answer your question, is thinking about those geopolitical and biopolitical functions of redaction, and also how we encounter redaction too. So my experience of not wanting to speak to state departments to find out information as to why this document is redacted is very different to my colleagues' experience, for example. So one of my colleagues, Rizwan, encountered the same issue, spoke straight to the Home Office, why are you not giving me this information? And they immediately gave it to him, right? So why is my experience different to him? And these are conversations that we're actually planning to have very soon. Thinking about those critical questions, I would say, about redaction and state encounters too.
Yeah, I mean, just as a follow-up point, I mean, I think if you could do that and you could trace the whatever the kind of politics of redaction for those who went to Guantanamo or were still there. I mean, from the moment, whatever their captivity started, and just kind of trace out that journey, and then what at different stages does redaction do? What does it look like the whole kind of aesthetics of it? But then of course there's the parallel story on top of that related, which is you're as a researcher trying to find out about all these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would make like a really rich and important whatever academic, intellectual, activist kind of contribution to just give this sense of kind of lived experience from for the different people involved.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Brian. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, Elspeth, yeah.
Well, I'll follow that up because I think Brian has already said this, but this idea of redaction from below is I don't think I've seen, or maybe I just have not. Maybe I need to go back and look at the literature to have more of a sense of if that word is being used for entities that are not the state. I mean, your framing of detainees as potentially being redacted or self-redacting is an interesting one that I've not heard before. I think it ties in with the conversations that we're having otherwise about resistance and secrecy, when, like you said at the very start of your talk about, the important role that hiding for protection plays. So yeah, I think, just echo, I think maybe just Brian's point and sort of compliment you on how generative I think that could be for rethinking all of these practices. Sorry, not to invite a specific response, but just more to.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, I mean, I had a couple. I mean, this question. I mean, I your talk and what you're researching, it seems like so well connected to so many of the themes that you see come up in other spin talks and work that people have done. And one of the things that really struck me was the idea, because I did a PhD in geography as well, so spiritually a geographer. And I feel one of the, simplest concepts that we have in geography, but one that you get a lot of mileage out of, is this idea of unevenness, right? So instead of thinking about like binaries between like the visible and the invisible, or like the, secret or revealed, it's like it seems like one of the things that you're doing so well is not getting caught up on these kind of binary things, but like looking how, and you use the word like biopolitical and geopolitical, right? How it is that there's kind of a distribution, or there's an uneven distribution of visibility. And then the only way to really figure out what the political stakes of these are to actually look at them, right? And figure out how those forms of visibility and invisibility are kind of distributed. And of course it's uneven, right? And you're showing it happening across all these different scales, right? From the actual, like, the map. That idea of geographical amnesia, like, really fascinating, right? So it's obviously on this kind of like, there's this global scale in which this happens, and then there's the sort of like bodily scale. What you were saying about I thought really fascinating too, is like, what do the photos reveal? What did the Abu Ghraib photos reveal? And there's something about the way that, yeah, there's this kind of almost like decomposition of that political subject, right? It means it's a body for the application of torture from a certain perspective, or it's a body that reflects this kind of erosion of U.S. political norms, right? So there's already something that's kind of that sense of a kind of unified political subject is already kind of getting decomposed there. Sorry, that's not really a question. Those are just sort of some observations, just things that I thought were really fascinating. And I guess the question that I have, which is sort of a speculative one, is, I guess, like, what is the experience, or have you, given everything that's been happening in the past couple of months in the United States, and elsewhere for that matter, like, are you, are you being struck by the parallels between what we saw during the War on Terror, and sort of what we're seeing again. And it just made me think about how many of the precedents for what we're seeing today are really set during the War on Terror. So I guess that's just, and this paranoid style of politics that we're seeing now again, right? You mentioned that kind of sense of paranoia. Yeah, I guess that's just like my question. What's the experience as a researcher of like looking at the War on Terror so closely and then experiencing what's kind of happening around us now?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I was 11 when 9/11 happened. Didn't even know what the World Trade Center was. I was like, didn't know it was going to envelop my life, but so it has. What I think is fascinating is the emergence of technology, right? And the centrality of technology in all of this. So as you know, I'm teaching about AI right now, and I'm very interested in the knowledge that is produced through AI systems, right? Specifically about Islamophobia and anti-racism, but what does it tell us about things such as war, right? And the war on terror? What does it conceal? What does it reveal? And I think that, for example, I was on Twitter the other day, which I don't ever really use anymore because it's yeah, it is what it is. But I noticed that when you're scrolling through the IDF's Twitter page, they are blanking out all the faces of the soldiers, right?
Really?
Yeah, it's fascinating. So you're going through the pictures on their feeds, and they're just like completely blurring the faces of the IDF soldiers. And somebody commented saying, "Oh, they're doing this because they don't want these soldiers to eventually end up being prosecuted for war crimes." And I found that fascinating, right? I found it really fascinating to think about what the circulation of images and documents and text is doing in the online space, and how that can contribute to something such as an eventual arrest and criminal charge, right? This idea of obscuring the visibility of these people to ensure that we never know who they are. So we're seeing parallels in that sense, right? We're seeing parallels in the sense where what has happened in Gaza, where everything is so visible, right? What is that doing to our sense of justice, right? Understanding, this unevenness that you speak of, right? I've never been so connected to a space, yet never been there before, and that is because of the centrality of technology. So I think there is scope to understand how technology is concealing and revealing certain things. And I think that would be a really interesting way to frame these discussions around secrecy and visibility, and how these technologies, specifically AI-powered ones, right? If you consider the differences between ChatGPT, let's say, and DeepSeek, you're going to get two different answers. Whereas DeepSeek completely erases any questions related to the Uyghurs, let's say. It will say the state of China looks after the Uyghurs, right? We are proud of the Xinjiang province, right? You'll get a different answer on ChatGPT. So I think there is something to be said about how these technologies are allowing us, or what is it concealing, or what is it revealing as well. So I hope that answers your questions. In many ways, we're seeing that sort of it's circular, right? We're seeing that repetition, but in many ways it's very different. And on a personal note, in the War on Terror, as I was very young, and now I'm a mother of two, right? The stakes are very different, and I think that dawns on me a lot.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, it's really interesting. And I mean, meanwhile, yeah, they're sort of trying to redact their Twitter feed. Meanwhile, the IDF is having this problem with actual IDF members just posting stuff on TikTok in a way that's really kind of from the institution's point of view, like problematic, right?
It's fascinating. So there's a page on Twitter called the Archive of Accountability, and it's documenting, right, all these posts and social media posts by those who have engaged in genocidal violence. And I think it is fascinating that we are keeping a record now, or the receipts of what is happening in the online space and how that correlates to the physical space too. So I think there's so much to be said about how technology is driving this idea about secrecy, in many ways trying to conceal certain aspects, whether it's the IDF trying to conceal faces, let's say, and what needs to be out there, right? We're seeing images, horrific images every day being circulated. So what does that mean?
Yeah. looking in the chat, and I see that we've got some comments from Claire and Natalie. Did either of you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. It was only just a very brief comment, because as you were talking, Shereen, I was just thinking that the role of technology in these processes is not just as a neutral conveyor belt, right? It's not just a transmission belt along which secrecy or exposure or truth or, you know, any of the sort of cognate concepts that you've been talking about. It's not just the neutral transmission belt. And I think maybe, speaking for Natalie here, the idea of algorithmic bias also speaks a little bit to that. But I wonder whether that could be a useful, whether you think that might be a useful idea worth exploring, this idea of technology is more than the neutral background, it's actually playing an active part. And I don't know, I mean, we've talked about it briefly in previous spin sort of talks or publications or whatever, but I think this is something that could be expanded on in a great detail. And I think your research sounds like the perfect sort of testing ground, if you like, for some of these ideas.
It's fascinating. So, you know, when I teach my students at LSE about AI, you know, the comment that we get, the feedback is, why are you so negative about AI, right? And I'm speaking to the next tech developers, right? So I'm conscious that what I'm doing. However, what you say is absolutely correct. This idea that ChatGPT is replacing everything, it's fundamentally changing human relations. I read an article the other day how somebody was using ChatGPT for bereavement purposes, that they were trying to get therapy through ChatGPT on TikTok. You know, the algorithm knows that I have a child who doesn't sleep at night. I was being told that ChatGPT could be used as a sleep trainer, right? So it's really fascinating what the information is, what we're being told. And when you're thinking about algorithmic bias, especially, something which I think it was in the article by Nath, but this idea that we are, as scholars, as academics, we are trained to see things in a certain way, right? So when I am inputting something in ChatGPT, like show me the sources for X, Y, Z, right? It will provide me sources from, so I think I used it once to say, provide me sources on prevent and counter extremism. The sources that it provided me were very state-centric or pro-prevent sources, right? That's all fine. However, if you didn't know that, you would be articulating certain narratives about a subject based on what you have been told. So I think there is so much there that we can really think about in terms of how we approach these technologies and what these technologies do to things such as our understanding of truth, the knowledge that we produce as well, which I think is so fascinating and something that we need to speak about more in relation to trying to see the war on terror, let's say. You know, what is it going to tell us? And I urge you all, actually, just on a side note, Google, ChatGPT yourselves, right? Maybe say something like, tell me some things that Claire Stevens has written. You're going to find hallucinations, right? Yeah, it's fascinating. I'm actually too scared to do so myself. However, it's fascinating. It will tell you things that you have written that you have never, ever, ever done so in your life, right? But to the untrained eye, that's all good, right? And for those who are doing academic misconduct, Peter, especially you, this will be very useful for you as well. Just check what sources have been hallucinated.
You just caused us all psychic damage now with this idea of ChatGPTing ourselves.
Fascinating.
We're all going to do it as soon as we hang. I've never even thought of the possible. My goodness.
Yeah.
That's great. Hannah, did you want to introduce yourself and ask a question?
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, Hannah. I am at the University of Bristol. And yeah, thank you so much for that. It was absolutely fascinating. So I work on military justice and stuff. So I come across loads of redacted documents and I was thinking about like how to get around redaction and stuff. So it's been really helpful. Thank you. And just kind of as you were mentioning the IDF Twitter feed just then, I was it was something I was thinking about during your presentation, but kind of the temporality of redaction as well is really interesting here in that, like, so you've got kind of you met like the geographical amnesia, there's also the temporal amnesia as well, right? And the denial of future, past and present. It's like this linear temporality for people within like detainees. And then like, just as, yeah, you were kind of mentioning like the redaction of faces and stuff is like in the anticipation of a very specific future, right? Which imagines that justice will happen. These will be defined as war crimes and stuff like that. So I was just wondering, yeah, if you could just reflect on, speak about kind of where, yeah, time and temporality might have featured in what you've been doing so far.
That's so fascinating. I was actually thinking about this question in relation to the redaction of the memoir. So Guantanamo Diaries, right? That very key passages about the abuse, right? We're all sort of like shaking the book thinking like, oh, I wish you would tell us who Mr. X is, right? So that we can get that sort of accountability, but we're never told. We're never told who it is and whatever. And there's this idea that these memoirs function as a form of longevity, right, beyond what happened in Guantanamo. That often what happened in Guantanamo was very concealed for a very specific reason. Documentaries such as Blacked Out Bay, for example, that was on Vice, really indicates the extent and the lengths to which the US administration went in the name of transparency to black out a lot of the prison itself. And so these memoirs function as a form of accountability, even though they are redacted. It's saying that, you know, XYZ happened in these spaces. And also it forces us to question that the reader, you know, what are you hiding? What is the function of redaction, right? Beyond, as you say, Hannah, like you're working on these documents, right? But that's just you as a researcher. What about the broader public, right? When they're encountering these ideas of redaction, what, you know, it's so frustrating. It's a barrier, essentially, so to speak. So I think this idea of temporality is really interesting, and I don't know the answer to this, but I do wonder when and if these documents will ever be unredacted related to the war on terror, because I don't know the answer to that. But there is something to be said about, you know, are they redacted as long as they are out of the public mind, so to speak? So in 100 years they become unredacted. I have no idea, but there is a question there about, you know, what is the function in keeping documents redacted? What is the goal of it? But as I think about these memoirs, especially, and I think about the cultural artifacts which are produced as a result of redaction, you really are thinking about creating some sort of permanence, which is why Twitter pages such as like the Archive of Accountability is so important, right? They're keeping those traces. The war on terror was very much a paper trail, so to speak, but now we've really evolved into the digital space, which I think is fascinating.
Thank you.
Thanks. Got a few minutes left. If there's any other interest from the crowd. Yeah, Natalie, could you introduce yourself?
I'm Natalie Jester. I'm a lecturer at the University of Gloucestershire. And I have a really, really general question, which is what drew you to these subjects in the first place?
The Guantanamo ones?
Any of the ones that you've talked about, really?
Yeah, okay. So a lot of it was the fact that, you know, I'm a Muslim woman, right? And I grew up in London, in Edgware Road to be specific, in a very Arab Muslim area. And we were constantly being faced and told that we were bad people. I was, you know, what's going on? What is this about? And so I write about this actually in a paper that's coming out soon, but this idea that I didn't actually know what was happening up until I went into university. So I didn't really know why we were being stopped, why our names were being flagged in systems, why, so my family's birthplace is Yemen, why Yemen all of a sudden was a place that we couldn't go to. You know, I didn't really understand that until I got to university. And so when the first detainees arrived in 2002, I was 12. Again, went through my whole life, and then until 2008 when I started university, and they were still being held, right? What's happening there? Why was this taking place? So I guess what drew me to this was this idea that such an injustice could happen, right, at that time. Why was this happening, which is essentially what I was interested in. And that's what drew me to figuring out what was going on in Guantanamo. Also, it was the element of secrecy too. I am drawn to it. I am drawn to knowing what was behind those fences. And I couldn't really understand it. Well, you could, I guess, understand it through what the state is saying or what articles are telling you that this is what's happening there. But I really wanted to understand, what was your experience there? And that sort of drew me to speaking to people such as, Mozambique for my podcast on Guantanamo Bay. Yeah, and it's still an ongoing project. It's one of those things where you're trying to answer a question for yourself and end up with many other questions that still need answering.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one more. Lisa?
Thanks. Yeah, no, I just wanted to say thank you, Shereen. Your work sounds really, really fascinating. And I just wanted to ask do you have any papers out yet? I mean, so I know you mentioned the one that's about to come out. Are there any already out that we can read?
Firstly, thank you, Lisa. Your work is like, what's the word? For anyone in the terrorism circles, we have to read Lisa's work, right? About knowledge production. So I do have a paper that's out with identities on following the paper trail with Prevent. So how does Prevent stick to our bodies as racialized Muslims? I think is really that's that one paper that came out of my PhD. I'm really interested in public engagement, so thinking about podcasts as well. So with Surviving Society, I have a lot of my material there, and I have a few other papers coming out too, specifically one thinking about the relationship between knowledge production and social geographies, and the relationship between the two, and this idea about, so I focus very heavily on what's been happening in Gaza especially, and the complete erasure of universities and what that does to our idea of knowledge production. So yeah, that's so far coming out, and I have a paper hopefully coming out with Rizwan Sabir thinking about this idea of documents too. So our how we embody state documents related to the war on terror.
Great. That all sounds amazing. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Forward to that.
You'll have to make sure to when those come out in publication to send them to the Spin newsletter so you can get the word out about those publications.
That I would love to. It's been such a pleasure just talking through these ideas and work in progress, so to speak.
Well, that's great. Can we give Shereen a round of applause for her talk today?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming to see us, and thanks Elspeth for having me chair the last spin of the year. It's been really great, and we'll see everyone next year.
Yeah.